In this last test for REM 151, Rangeland Principles, there will be a few questions about grazing systems. There is a reading on the class webpage called The Summary of Grazing Systems Used in Rangelands of Western United States and Canada. It's a good reading, but I want to give you just a little bit more overview so that you can really answer questions related to grazing systems. First of all, continuous season-long grazing is when you put the livestock in a pasture and they're there the whole grazing season or the whole year depending on where you live. The effect on animal production is usually that it's quite good. Animals can go anywhere and eat anything they want at any time of the year. So usually we see really high animal production on continuous systems. On range condition, however, animals tend to go anywhere they want and they tend to congregate in areas they like. So for example, in the picture above, in the ranch above, there's a stream that goes right through the pasture. If this were in a continuous grazing system, I'd expect that stream to be heavily used and maybe degraded because animals can use it at any time of the year. If you think about this from a recreation standpoint, say we took that same ranch and instead of having cattle grazing everywhere, we had 3 campgrounds. Well, what would be the effect of continuous season-long camping? Well, the people could go to whichever campground and whichever site they wanted, so probably they would like that recreational experience. It would tend to spread people out across all the campsites, and they could always pick their favorite one. But the effect on the land would be that the favorite or best campsites, maybe the ones nearest the creek, would always be used. So when you think about how animals use pastures, it's really not all that different than how we use pastures, and the effects that we might have on the land, in this case for camping, would be similar to the effect that cattle might have. To limit the access of animals to the same preferred sites all the time, we implement a deferred rotation system, which is that we divide the pasture into several pastures, or the ranch into several pastures, and then we decide to set one aside each year, at least one that does not receive grazing until after the spring period, until after the plants go to seed. That's the definition of a deferment, to not have grazing until after seed set for the important forage plants. So in the example up above, we have 4 pastures, and we might rotate through those so that at least 1 out of every 4 years, one of those pastures is not grazed in the spring through seed set, which would be a deferment. So the deferment would be rotated among the pastures. The effect on animal production is still pretty good. Animals still have quite a few choices in the pasture, so we seldom see reduction of animal production. However, we often see an improvement in rangeland condition because at least every pasture has a deferment. Every once in a while, there's always some time where the plants and areas of a pasture can be guaranteed that they will not be grazed. Okay, again, now think about this from a camping standpoint. What if we had 4 campgrounds and we noticed that there was some heavy use in areas that were highly preferred? So we might defer campground use. We might take one of those campgrounds and put it out of use for the spring every 4th year. That would be a deferment. It would mean that that one campground would receive rest from camping or from human activities at least once every 4 years. So the effect on people's recreation experiences might be small downside, because maybe they have their favorite campsite and they're not going to get to go there once every 4 years. But it's probably still pretty good. They still have access to a lot of campsites. The effect on the land, however, might be quite good, because those heavily used areas now at least will get deferment once every 4 years in this case. To go a step further and make sure that the plants not only get deferred in the spring through the period when they're sensitive to grazing, which would be a deferment, but to make sure that they have a chance to go to seed and that that seed gets a chance to mature and fall to the ground, is the principle on which rest rotation systems were designed, or the Horme system. This is a case where you have at least 3 pastures, and at least one of those pastures gets a full year of rest. And again, this was designed to give at least one pasture a chance to have no grazing while the plants are most sensitive to grazing, but also go a little bit further and let those plants set seed and drop those seeds. The effect on animal production is actually kind of bad, because the way this system is designed, the animals are always moving into a pasture that was rested, and so the forage in that pasture is usually kind of, it's got old stems in it, and it's not always the most greenest, nutritious area. So, and then also, if we have 3 pastures and we take one completely out of the system, that means that the animals are concentrated in the other two pastures, so there's actually a higher stocking rate in any one year in the remaining pastures. So for those two reasons, stocking rate ending up higher in the remaining pastures that aren't rested, and the fact that we're always moving into pastures that have been rested that tend to have a little lower quality, we often see a small reduction in the production per animal, or in the weight gain per animal. It's usually not severe, but it can be unless this system is well applied. On the other hand, we often see improvements in rangeland condition because now we're giving one pasture a whole year rest. It's usually not a lot better than a deferment, but it often can be a little bit better because plants have a chance to set seed. So this system was designed really for really for rangeland condition improvement, and not so much of a concern for animal production. Although animal production can be quite good if the stocking rate is set well and the animals are managed well. I think again about this if you were camping, if you had 3 campgrounds on your ranch, and you were worried about the condition of one of those campgrounds, you might remove it from camping, take it off the camping list for a whole year. So among those 3 pastures, one year the west pasture might be removed from letting people camp. The next year it might be the south pasture or the south campground, and the next year it might be the campground right near headquarters. So the effect on the people's recreation experience might be a little low because people probably have their favorite site and they're going to be mad that they won't be able to use it for a whole year once every 3 years, but the effect on the land is quite good. So again, the principles are the same for grazing, livestock, or for human uses. There are times when we need to remove human or livestock use from an area at least through the sensitive period, through seed set, and that would be a deferment, or through a whole year, which would be a rest. So that's the basic 3 principle or systems we have. There's a real modern system that is being used that's called management intensive or short duration. In this case, you take a ranch and you divide it into many pastures, and you graze each pasture for a few days each year. So what happens in this case is the pasture gets grazed, but then it gets some number of days to recover before the animals come back. The effect on animal production can be quite good because animals are always moving on to areas that have been grazed where the older material is removed and the fast-growing vegetation is accessible. The effect on rangeland condition can be either way. Sometimes it can be improvement if there's plenty of moisture during the growing season when plants can recover. It can also be bad if there's not enough moisture to recover. So these systems can work really well as a pasture system, or especially they work well in areas that get moisture all growing season, such as in the southeast. I've seen these used in Arkansas and the southeast fairly effectively. But they don't often work in western United States because we don't get moisture all year round. Again, it depends on your management practices, but you have to be careful with the system because it's very intense. Think about this now from a camping standpoint. What if you had 8 campsites and you let people use them only for a few days, say a few days in June, and then a few days in July, and then a few days in August? It's very intense. You'd have to go around and keep moving signs that say this campground is closed, and people may not always know what's closed or open, so they might be frustrated. They would get used to it, especially the regular campers would, but it can tend to reduce the human experience, but it could affect the land quite well. At least there's some pastures that are always not without camping. Okay, so the bottom line of whether using this kind of intensive management system with grazing or with camping is that it really depends on the skill of the manager. So those are kind of the principles that you got to think about: the skill of the manager, whether there's a deferment, whether there's a rest, and how it rotates through the system. The one that we use in Idaho that's really common is not really a system, but it's a planned grazing method that's talked about in the paper that you have to read for class. I'm just going to mention it here. What happens in much of Idaho, especially with sheep producers, is they start out in winter range, such as in southern Idaho, and they graze that during the winter, like say January, February, or March, and then in the spring they'll go to what they call spring-fall range. So those are a little higher elevation. It's often where they might lamb in the spring and often doing range lambing, so that's the April, March, June, and then they're going to start moving up in elevation. They'll move to their summer range, which is often Forest Service range, spend the summer there where it's still green, and then after the lambs are are done growing or the calves are removed and sent to feedlot or sent to lower ground, then the cows or the ewes start to move back down in elevation. And now it's fall. All the land, whether high or low, is dormant, and they move back onto that winter range where often there are shrubs that provide good protein for winter. So this is a very good system for livestock production because in the winter they're on range that has shrubs which provide important protein in the winter. Then they move to some summer-fall range, which is a little higher elevation, has some green material in the spring. They move to the highest range that's green in the summer. So this is called the follow the green or seasonal suitability system. It's really good for animal production because animals are always on green vegetation. It's also pretty good for the range as long as the animals are moved higher in elevation before the plants set seed. So this system can be quite good for both animals and plants. It's just that it requires a lot of territory. That's the end of what I have to give you an overview of grazing. Go ahead and read that paper by Howery and then re-listen to this, and I think the terms that I use will make sense.